Welcome to Sheffield Hallam University Social Justice Week. This is the recovery and drug legalisation discussion. My name is David Best. I'm Professor of Criminology in the Department of Law and Criminology here. The Social Justice Week is coordinated through the Helena Kennedy Centre for International Justice, which is based in our department, the Department of Law and Criminology. It's jointly run by Law and Criminology and Humanities here. And really, the primary purpose of these events is to raise awareness of key issues around social justice, to engage students, staff and the general public in discussion and debate, and to promote the central values of our centre, and those values are widening access to justice, promotion of human rights, ethics and legal practice, overcoming social injustice, enabling desistance and recovery, and promoting criminal justice accountability. I want to start this by saying, why are we having this discussion? And I guess that the reason for this is that I was approached by Fiona Gilbertson, who for some reason has decided to sit on the floor rather than a chair, to see if I'd be willing to give an opinion as somebody who's written and talked a lot about addiction recovery over the last 10 years or so on the legalisation debate, which has been ongoing in our field for a number of years. And I have, over the course of that 10 years or so, I have taken a fairly painful sit on the fence position on this discussion and this debate. And the reason has been the recovery discussion itself has been such a contentious area. I've always felt I don't know enough about the legalisation debate, and it's a fight too far for me. And a couple of things have caused me to reevaluate that discussion, and they really were. The first was, as I discussed with Fiona, was reading a book called Chasing the Scream by Johann Hari, which really did make me think quite a lot about what my position should be in this. The second issue, which I'll come to shortly, is really about the question of what criminalisation does and what involvement in the criminal justice system does that potentially makes recovery a much harder journey. So we will talk about a lot of the standard stuff around legalisation today. I wanted to frame it by putting up some kind of parameters for the discussion, because I guess it's important to say we need to be clear about some of the things we might talk about, and some of the parameters of the discussion are we actually talking about legalisation as in a change in legislation? Or are we talking about a decriminalisation, which is a removal or a reduction in the penalties associated with possession or use? So that might be the first place of a continuum that people might have different opinions about. The second is the legal context, and I guess for the UK, in the UK context, that's primarily around the Misuse of Drugs Act 1971, although there increasingly will be attention around the Psychoactive Substances Act 2016, which is due to come into force shortly. So that's a new piece of legislation, and while the framing is primarily around the Misuse of Drugs Act, there have been a number of tinkerings through legislation over the years. And I guess one of the big questions that provokes is the whole scheduling system created under the Misuse of Drugs Act obsolete or outdated, and does it need to change in certain ways? The third parameter is, what substances are we talking about? And I hope at least some of the speakers will talk about, what do they really mean? Are they talking about all illicit drugs, or is this really a discussion about cannabis? And the last parameter that I wanted to be clear about is, to what extent, irrespective of those discussions, are we talking about regulation or deregulation? So are we talking about increased access to diamorphine through prescription from GPs or through controlled use through pharmacies? Or are we talking about buying crack cocaine in Tesco's? That's questions of regulation that may well be separate from discussions about legalisation or decriminalisation. So I don't intend to give an opinion on these things, other than to say these are complex questions. And as complex questions, I'm absolutely delighted that we've got such a kind of expert group of contributors today who will hopefully help to inform you about some of these things. The only contribution I want to make to the start of this discussion is about when we talk about either recovery from substance dependence or desistance from crime, we are really talking about a three-stage process. And in the desistance debate in criminal justice, Fergus McNeill, who's a professor of social work and criminal justice at Glasgow University, has recently argued that if you want to understand how people make lasting changes to their criminality, there's three bits to it. Primary desistance is when you stop offending. Secondary desistance is when the people round about you, friends, family, your social networks aren't involved in crime or criminality. But tertiary desistance is when the world believes you've changed and accepts you as reintegrated back into so-called normal society. And in the recovery debate, we've gone through a very similar process of saying, when people attempt to recover from alcohol or drug dependence, it's not just a case of stopping using drugs. And the argument would be it's a 5-year journey. And it involves three core things that have to accrue for people. Personal capital, they have to develop the personal recovery skills and capabilities. Social capital, they have to change their networks to networks that support the change. And community capital, which is in essence the same social contract that Fergus McNeill talked about for crime. In other words, it's all very well changing your friends and changing your self-esteem and well-being if nobody will give you a job, a house, or a chance to get your life back together. And so the notion of community recovery capital very much maps onto that idea of tertiary desistance because it's a social contract. If we want people to recover and desist as a community and a society, we have to accept them back. Now, for that to happen, we have to be very careful about how we label people and categorise people through the criminal justice system, because we know there's a thing called negative recovery capital. That what are the barriers to people successfully changing from addiction lifestyles to successful reintegration lifestyles? Unfortunately, one of the barriers is being older. Another of the barriers is being female. A third barrier is having significant mental health problems. And a fourth barrier is having been through the criminal justice system. In other words, people who have been labelled as criminals have a much harder journey to recovery and are much statistically less likely to achieve and sustain recovery than people who haven't. Why should that be? Because the criminal justice system, and in particular prison, messes people up. More than 70% of the prison population has 2 or more mental health disorders. Male prisoners are 14 times more likely to have 2 or more mental health disorders than men in general. And for women in the prison system are 35 times more likely to have 2 diagnosed mental health problems. The suicide rate in prison is almost 15 times higher than in the general population. And for women, just over a quarter of female remand prisoners have tried to kill themselves in the previous year. Prison doesn't do good things for you. And if you criminalise behaviour, you stigmatise people, and the process of criminalisation is harmful. So, arguing purely from a recovery and desistance point of view, if you label, exclude and net widen, you potentially make the journey to reintegration much, much harder for people. That is a brief recovery perspective overview. These two people are both experts. The man on the left is Howard Becker, the man on the right is Stan Cohen. Stan Cohen is the author of a fabulous book called Folk Devils and Moral Panics. And I was very fortunate that when I did my Masters in Criminology at London School of Economics, Stan Cohen was my tutor for that time. And he was a master of explaining how, when people get labelled as a criminal, two things happen. One, society rejects them, and two, they come to see themselves much, much more negatively. And his view was, if you criminalise behaviours like drug behaviours, you in essence create a world where the transition to meaningful activity and reintegration is harder because the world doesn't accept people and people find it much harder to be accepted by that process. So after that brief sojourn through recovery and desistance theory, I'm going to pass over to our speakers to start the discussion. So what I'm now going to do is I'll ask each speaker to make a contribution of between 10 and 15 minutes. Please keep any questions you've got just now. Before we do that, Andy is going to briefly talk about our technology that we want to utilise today for our voting process, because what we want to do is to make this an interactive process, so we'll have a couple of minutes on that and then we'll start with our contributors. What we want to do is we're going to start off by asking each of you to take one of these little voting sets, and we're going to ask you a couple of questions. From our point of view, there's no point in having these discussions as one-off events. What we need to do is to make this some way of raising consciousness and awareness. So I'll pass over to Andy to explain how that's going to work.
Thank you, David. First test vote is obviously a little silly one, just to make sure everybody. So I'm not asking you to vote just yet. So if everybody votes now, and you'll see the responses fly up there. I don't know how many people have we got here today. Do you know? 50 odd, so it's a few trickling in. Okay, everybody voted? There we go. No, okay. Not quite as many number 3s as I might have hoped, but yeah, okay. Again, we just wanted to get a feel for how many people in the audience themselves are in recovery and whether we can relate that to some of the debate topics. So if you can vote now on that question, and that's the result of that one. And I think we've just got one more just so that we can test how from the beginning of the day to the end of the day things have changed. So if everybody could vote now on that question, consider how informed you feel about the key issues around legalisation, decriminalisation of legal drugs. Okay, 51, no more trickled in. Somewhat informed. There we go.
I'm delighted to say we've got an excellent panel for the next session. And first up to make his presentation is Ian Sherwood.
I work for a non-statutory organisation that provides treatment, needle exchange, it provides supported housing, a residential detox service, a number of things, but I'm not speaking for them today. I'm also a volunteer with Transform, an organisation that I've supported for a number of years now. Danny will probably tell me how long that's been. 20, all right, it's been a long time. I came into the field of the treatment of drug misuse in the mid-1980s, which was a very strange time. We had a sudden and rather huge explosion of heroin use in the United Kingdom, mostly in the urban centres. And I live and work in Bristol, and the area didn't escape that upsurge in drug use. And so I ended up working with people with quite severe drug problems, because my professional background was, of all things, as a community psychiatric nurse. And I was used to visiting people who were experiencing severe, enduring mental health problems in their own homes. And it just happened that the psychiatrist that I worked with had started to prescribe methadone detoxes for people. And he said, would you go and see somebody, you know, and just support them? You know, I didn't have a clue, really. I really didn't have a clue at the time, and neither did he, really. But he was a brave man, had put his sort of toe in the water to see what he could do to help. And I started visiting people who had quite long careers with heroin, mostly injected, in their own homes, and this was in the delightful, leafy, rural environs of Bath, of all places, you know. And so you get all these images at the time that serious drug use, which was about deprivation, it was about inner cities, it was about violent crime. And I was driving around the boundaries of Bath and Wiltshire, going into these beautiful limestone villages, little cottages, and seeing people who were telling me about their experience with heroin. And that was a really, really good education, because most of the received ideas about heroin were entirely negative, and for very good reasons. People died, people got sick, they got ill, they got into prison. But when you get to know people and you're talking to them in their own home, and you say, well, how did this all come about then, you know? And they were quite frank, and they said, well, somebody had some, I tried it, and it was fantastic. You know, it was the best experience I'd had taking a drug. And that's how they got into it. They thoroughly enjoyed it. And so you know, was that just the effect? And they were saying, well, no, it said our sex life improved tremendously. You know, this was for couples. And you read any textbook, and it'll say that with heroin, dependent heroin use, the sex drive generally disappears. And yes, for most people it does. But there's a period in people's use where it doesn't, where actually it might be quite helpful to their relationship. So the first thing you learn in this business, that what it says in textbooks, what it says in research, and you know, I'm not knocking David here, who's done some fantastic research in his career, is that that isn't the whole truth. Research is a very narrowing focus on a very complex behaviour, on a very complex situation. And you can look at the chemical properties of a drug, and you can isolate those properties and just study those in a very refined way. It doesn't tell you anything about the social circumstances of the person that was using that drug. And one of the things that for me over the years happened was that coming to a realization that this was really about people and the circumstances in which they lived, and it was very little to do with the drug. I became a fairly ardent proponent of legalisation through one situation, and that was, of all places, Glastonbury Festival. I don't know if you've ever been to Glastonbury Festival, but it's always been enormous. It's always had around 100,000 people in the Somerset countryside, come rain or shine, having a fantastic time. And unfortunately, in the 1980s, there was a situation where, because uniformed police weren't allowed on the site, it was policed around the boundaries. And so the police force that in Bristol, where I lived, had a fairly admirable policy of cautioning people in possession of small amounts of substances. The rules changed completely at the festival, and all sorts of rather unpleasant practices, such as police officers stopping people going to the festival saying, have you got any drugs on you? If it's a small amount, you'll only get a caution. and people would say, oh, you know, they'd get in their pocket and they'd sort of hand over a sort of 3 grams of cannabis, and police say, oh, I'm terribly sorry, that's in excess of our cautioning policy, you're nicked. And they set up a massive temporary police station on the Shepton Mallet showground, and they would process hundreds of people over the course of 3 days. And I used to, as a community psychiatric nurse, I had some really great jobs, and one of them was working in the welfare services at the festival, which is a guaranteed free ticket, free food, and access to one of the only flushing toilets on the site. And so one day I was rostered to go down to the magistrates' court and give advice. What that means is you stand on a chair, and in the foyer of the magistrates' hall you get everybody who's up in front of the magistrates that day gathered round and tell them what the deal is. You know, plead guilty if you haven't got any previous offence, blah 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 blah. And then people, you know, the mass justice that had been sort of practiced with the miners' strike and all the rest of it, people went up to the bench, about half a dozen at a time. Their names were read out, they were guilty, you know, and fine and costs and all the rest of it. And I'd get through all the simple possessions, and then possession with intent to supply. And I remember this guy, he was about, I don't know, 18, 19. He was brought in handcuffs from the cells up to the bench for a possession with intent to supply offence, and the amount of cannabis he had on him was about 5 grams. But he'd made the classic error of, when being asked, is this all for your own use, young man? He said, oh no, he said, some of it's for my girlfriend as well. Now, when we meet up inside, I'm going to give her some. Possession with intent to supply, result, you know. And that was, for me, that was my radicalising moment. And since then, I don't support the control of drugs by the law in the way that it is, and would dearly like to see the law changed, and not just about cannabis. There's a far wider remit to this, and I'm one of those people that used to have a caseload of people who received prescribed heroin. There aren't that many in this country, but I have to say that the experience of doing that was a real eye-opener. Seeing people who ran their own businesses, who had engagement with the wider world, and the only difference between them and other people that you'd really be aware of was the fact that they had to go to the chemist every single day and pick up ampules of pharmaceutical heroin. And they lived normal lives. And the interesting thing is that everybody says, well, if you offered that to everyone, everybody would want it. And my experience is actually, no, they don't. We had people who were on heroin prescriptions, and they say, this really isn't working for me. and they'd given it a good try, and they said, I find that the levels going up and down over that time doesn't work, and they wanted to change to methadone, which at the time a lot of people on methadone were saying, I could really do with a diamorphine prescription actually, because methadone's not. So things aren't as you might think they are, you know. And this is again about individual variation and how we are in our relationship to the drugs we use. I used to be heavily dependent on tobacco. Nicotine is the most addictive drug. I think it's just that goes without any debate particularly. And I smoked solidly from the age of 14. And I didn't give up until I was about in my late 50s. And it took me quite a few goes to do it as well. And about 2 years after I'd stopped, I really started to feel the benefit of it, and I was really glad that I'd done it. One of the things I learnt through giving up tobacco, if anybody tells you that nicotine isn't a psychoactive drug, you know, just send them packing. I didn't realise that I was actually an emotionally vulnerable individual to the extent that I was until I stopped smoking every day. And this is a legal drug. It might be expensive. You might have to spend a lot, but it's a legal drug. It's easily accessible. But it really messes up your head. It really messes up your feelings. And I do find it odd that now we have a psychoactive substances bill that tobacco has been specifically excluded from it. I mean, you know, that is quite remarkable, isn't it? That you can legislate against a vasodilator such as poppers, make those illegal, but specially preserve the sanctity of tobacco as obviously being completely harmless, no problem. We just need to accommodate that within society. So how much time have I got, David?
2 minutes.
About 2 minutes, right. Here's the special kind of claim, really. We're seeing a significant increase in the amount of people dying from heroin. Right? This is a fundamentally serious problem. It tends to be older men. It tends to be people who are not engaging with services, who are leaving services. It's probably connected to the increase in housing insecurity and homelessness. And why on earth we can't do what everybody else in Europe does, which is have drug consumption rooms. There has never been an overdose in a drug consumption room. Right? That's, you know, we can give out naloxone to reverse overdoses. Why not just go the whole hog and say, if you want to take a drug, here's a place that's safe to do it. You'll get not only clean equipment, you'll get specialists, people there. If you need other help, you can access it there. That, to me, would seem like a rational response. For the country that pioneered and led the way with needle exchanges, we seem to have developed a massive cowardice around harm reduction and the pragmatic ways of changing the consequences of using drugs. We seriously need to do it, and that's my big ask, really, for people. If you get the opportunity to say, what do we need to do? We need to stop heroin overdoses, and we need to get some drug consumption rooms established in the UK. Right, I'll leave it there. Thank you.
First of all, I'd like to thank David Best for inviting us here today. I came to see David to ask him for a quote for our new campaign, which he gave us within about 3 minutes, and then he was like, well, what are you here for? What do you want? So this is what we got, so thanks very much. My name's Fiona, I'm in long-term recovery. I'm not going to go into what that means. My colleague Suzanne's going to talk about the recovery movement later. But I suppose what recovery means for me now is I don't feel alone, I don't feel unloved, I don't feel unlovable. That's my husband there. I've got 2 beautiful dogs. I'm willing to show any pictures after the break. So it kind of feels a little bit odd for me to do this because I'm going to talk a lot about my past, and I'm not defined by my past anymore. Do you know, like David was saying, you get to a point where it doesn't hold any power over you. But I represent an organisation called Recovering Justice, which I set up with myself and Suzanne Sharkey. Recovering Justice was founded by people in recovery from substance use who believe that the criminalisation and stigmatisation of people who use drugs is inhumane, ineffective, counterproductive and costly. Backed by international evidence and informed by personal experience, we're going to work towards a policy position which treats people with compassion and understanding rather than punishment. And our aims are to bring people with experience of drug use together with drug policy reform organisations to create a voice for policy change. So I'm a survivor of the war on drugs, which was never a war on drugs. It was a war on people. Anyone who has ever used drugs, their families and their communities become part of that war. My personal experience is what motivates what I do today. I was a heroin user in the 1980s in Edinburgh, and the response to the heroin problem was driven by the media and imposed by the police. It wasn't that sophisticated. The media were saying we should be sent to an island in the middle of the Firth and Forth, and the police threatened every chemist who was selling clean syringes with closure or arrest. The law was interpreted in such a way that having a syringe could get you arrested and sentenced to up to 3 months in prison. There was no methadone programs, there was no detox, and there was no rehabs. The police were violent and corrupt. The dealers were becoming increasingly so. We were frightened of prison, we were frightened of violence from the police and the dealers. And I remember at that time there was a turf war between two rival gangs, and people were being kidnapped, tortured and firebombed. And you've got to remember, like, when I'm talking, we were not organised criminals. We were mostly teenagers and in our early 20s. And we were really frightened, and we went to the police for help, which nobody really did, but we were that frightened. And we were told, we're waiting for one of them to kill one of you so we can get them on a decent charge. So they were watching what was going on, and they were just waiting for a murder. When you remove people's human rights, you make them less than human, and that's what we'd become. This hardline approach didn't decrease drug use, it drove people underground, and it created shooting galleries where one needle would be used by dozens of us. By the 1990s, Edinburgh had become the AIDS capital of Europe. Between 50 and 60% of the community in Edinburgh had HIV. Now compare that to Glasgow, with 9% who had adopted a harm reduction approach. Stigma is insidious. When society tells you you're worthless, criminal and deviant for long enough, you start to believe it. I spent a lot of the 90s watching my friends die, not from drugs, but from a preventable disease that had been fueled by bad policy and stigma. I would go to funerals where I couldn't look their parents in the eye because I felt guilty that I was still alive. My ex-partner died when he was 31. We actually thought he was really lucky to have got past 30, as most people didn't. He had spent the last 3 years of his life in prison, locked wards and latterly hospitals. His only crime was taking a drug that society had decided was illegal. He died believing that he got what he deserved and that he was a bad person. Stigma is insidious and it's deadly. My past doesn't define me now, and it's not something I think about, so why am I talking about this today? Well, recovery to me is about community and connection. Today, Russia has over 1 million cases of HIV. 60% of them are people who use drugs. This is a disease that's entirely preventable. They have no methadone programs and are being treated in the same way we were 30 years ago. That's our community. If we don't learn from history, we're doomed to repeat it. And let me be really clear, there have been no fundamental changes to the law that would keep us safe from this happening again here today. What we have now are concessions and not rights. My story is not unique. For every former drug user, there will be 10 who died before them. They will have spent time in prison, been arrested multiple times, and in all likelihood have been told that there's no funding when they ask for help. They will have died from preventable diseases, preventable overdose, hopelessness and suicide. They are the casualties in this country of the war on drugs. The war on drugs is not a fair fight, and it never has been. It has no impact on drug use and less on problematic drug users. It offers no solutions, only more suffering and death. However, there is a solution. one that everyone here can become part of. Never underestimate the power of people to change seemingly ingrained systems. In fact, historically, it is the only thing that truly has. I have been privileged enough to watch communities change the face of disease and injustice. The diverse HIV-positive community, their friends and family, stood up and joined together to say enough is enough. We said that your response to this is inadequate and harmful. Your response to this is killing us, as surely as the disease itself will. And within a decade, that disease had a treatment that actually worked, and it stopped HIV in its tracks. With that came a health care response and prevention. Johann Hari recently wrote a book called Chasing the Screamer. In it he says, "We have been singing war songs to our addicts for the last 100 years. Let's start singing them love songs instead." There is a solution, and everyone here is part of that. We're here today to talk about what peace looks like. I'm here with Anyone's Child, a campaign started by mothers that I couldn't look in the eye 30 years ago. I'm also here with LEAP, Law Enforcement Against Prohibition, the police I used to resent and fear. Today we are united in a common purpose to advocate for peace. That for me is what recovery is about. Drug policy reform is not about drugs. Like all human rights movements, it's about freedom. Freedom from oppression, freedom from stigma, freedom from imprisonment and criminalisation. It is first and foremost a movement for peace. It is the stories and voices of ordinary people like you and me that will open and change the hearts and minds of others. There are people here today who will want to add their voices. Please come and speak to us. Many of you are survivors of the war on drugs, and we all know people who didn't make it. Together we can stop this. 80 years ago, two men sat down and wrote a book that challenged the way people thought about addiction. The Big Book of Alcoholics Anonymous, and it transformed the lives of many people like me. They wrote that book in a time when no one believed change was possible, and that people with substance use disorders were condemned to go on to the bitter ends, jails, institutions, and death. They were leaders in the recovery movement, and their vision and belief in a better way was simple but revolutionary. That book and its many offspring showed us that caring for each other would set us free. 20 years ago, two men sat down and founded an organisation called Transform on those exact principles. They had a vision of what a world without a war on drugs would look like. Get this. They even wrote a blueprint for it. Danny's signing copies at the end. People thought they were crazy, and in response they said, "Just wait, in time presidents will come knocking wanting to know what peace will look like." To date, they have informed 2 presidents and helped 4 states work towards a peaceful, more compassionate solution. When people do the right things for the right reasons, amazing things happen. One of them is here today, and I'm going to hand over to Danny Kuslik, peace advocate. Thank you.
I'm Danny Kuslik. Thank you so much for that, Fiona. I'm honoured to be here. Thank you for inviting me. I founded Transform, as Fiona said, 20 years ago. At the time, I was a drugs worker working in the criminal justice system at Bristol Drugs Project with heavy-end heroin and crack users. And I just want to tell you an anecdote that led me. It was a kind of a real moment. I hadn't been working there very long. I'd been a week at Bristol Drugs Project, and I was working in the drop-in, where people came for chats, for coffee, for needle exchange, and various other things. And very much a newbie, very green, quite anxious really about meeting a new client group. So on the Thursday, I remember chatting to a guy who was in a wheelchair, whose injecting had really messed his legs up. A guy who'd been made redundant from British Aerospace. Older guy, hadn't started using until he was in his 40s, I think. And then the next day, John wasn't there. And neither were 4 other people who were regular users of the drop-in centre. The reason they weren't there was because they were dead. A particularly strong batch of heroin had hit Bristol. And loads of people had overdosed, and half a dozen had died. I hadn't worked in an environment where clients just didn't turn up the next day because they were dead. And that stayed with me. And I'd like to dedicate this presentation to John and the others who didn't make it, because a lot of this is about the people who aren't here, who didn't get a chance to recover at all because they died. And that's one of the things that just, as Ian was saying, people don't overdose in safe consumption sites, and people don't overdose when they're clinically prescribed the correct dose of heroin. But you can't do that when you're just getting a wrap with no information on it, no purity guide, no safer use warning. A little bit about Transform. We are now, 20 years later, an internationally recognised NGO with offices in Bristol, London, and we partner with an outfit in Mexico City, where over the last 5 years, 80,000 people have killed each other in turf wars and 20,000 have disappeared. It genuinely is a war. And one of the things that really I think we need to remember all the way through this is not only do people can't recover when they're dead, it's also very difficult to recover when you're alive in a war zone. And to the extent that we create an environment that is as toxic and dangerous as prohibition creates, it does enough make it difficult for people to move on. I want to start from just the position that I kind of broadly categorize drug users into two broad groups: those who use to feel good and those who use to stop feeling bad. There is a grey area clearly, and people move between the two. But it's important to remember that not everybody needs help and treatment. The vast majority don't. They just need clean drugs. They need to be not ostracized from society, and they need to be kept safe. Clearly, the other much smaller group need help and support. Neither of those groups need the intervention of the criminal justice system. It's just totally inappropriate. It's not, I hope it's clear now from what Ian and Fiona have said, that this is not an appropriate response to dealing with people who are either curious and having fun, or who have significant problems that need addressing. One of the basic tenet of the prohibition identifies a specific group of people who use a particular group of psychoactive substances as a threat. It's very clear in the 1961 United Nations Convention on Drugs. The preamble identifies addiction as evil. It uses that word. Addiction is evil. Addiction to these drugs, not the ones that are exempted under our terrible new Psychoactive Substances Act. Alcohol and tobacco are clearly exempted. They're not evil. They're having a drink, having a smoke, having a laugh, and they make a lot of money both for the industry and for governments who tax them. So not them, but addiction to those other drugs is evil. And you can see that built in to the whole international framework, which then at the national level is our Misuse of Drugs Act, It's designed to ostracize, to stigmatize, to discriminate, to marginalize, to make people the other. And I just want to draw on a comment that I was chatting to a friend of mine just last Friday before Mothering Sunday. And he said, wouldn't it be, what we should have, he said, is Othering Sunday. Othering Sunday, where we identify all the people that we excluded from mainstream society and identify them and ostracize them more fully, especially on Othering Sunday. The identification of the other here is poignant and so focused. And treating people as a threat. What you have here is the identification. Basically, we're treating these people as a threat, as a contagion, as a plague. It's kind of like Typhoid Mary. So if you think about the way that we deal with, for instance, smallpox. Smallpox was identified as a real problem. And the idea was that we needed to neutralize and eventually eradicate it. We did. The idea is, and the idea was, and it still is amongst a lot of people, is that we can eradicate people who use the wrong drugs. We can eradicate that use, non-medical use of those particular drugs from society. And the way that we deal with that clearly is a very different way than you would if you were actually dealing with those people with tolerance, acceptance, love, and compassion. I just want to very quickly shoot through some principles and some technical stuff just on legal regulation and come back to where it fits with recovery at the end. Look, we have common goals here. This is not an ideological position. It's a position of social justice that supports protecting the young and vulnerable, promoting public health, reducing drug-related crime, promoting security, protecting human rights, and providing good value for money. This is a really useful way of looking at what best practice in legal regulation is about. At one end, so the axes. So it's a drug policy spectrum that runs through from commercial, unregulated legal markets, tobacco, alcohol, big pharmaceuticals. And at the other end is the unregulated market that occurs when you prohibit. Any demand-led trade is going to just spawn social and health harms in the same way that not fettering the worst tendencies of commercial drug dealers also spawn significant social and health harms. And what the aim is to move towards the lowest part of the U-curve here. Strict control and regulation will reduce, or should aim to reduce, social and health harms. And in fact, that is the direction of cannabis policy, where decriminalisation and legal regulation is moving us back towards government control and regulation. And the same is happening with not quick enough, but with alcohol and tobacco, where the bans on smoking in public places, plain packaging, putting them behind the screens in shops. Ultimately, though, we'd like to see alcohol and tobacco come out of supermarkets, for instance. This is about strict control and regulation of all drugs, and we need to legalise and regulate because drugs are dangerous, not because they're safe. Yeah, so it's not about looking at having fun and treating them as if they're all benign. They're not. They need to be looked after. The people who use them and the people who sell them and produce them need to be looked after and controlled. So just to say, legalisation itself is a process of moving from prohibition to regulation. It's not an end goal. So legalisation is a verb, if you like. Regulation is a noun. There's some pictures of what it would look like, and what it does look like already. We know how to regulate these things. We're not stepping into new territory. As Fiona mentioned, the Bible. 2009, we produced this. Basically, a tome that shows precisely how to legally regulate all currently prohibited drugs. It's now been downloaded 750,000 times. If only we had asked for £1 every time somebody downloaded that damn thing, we wouldn't be in the funding problems that we have now. And it's translated into 4 languages, for those of you who don't have English as a first language. So what is regulation? It's the regulation of risky products. And it's a primary function of government. That's what government's supposed to do. Prohibition is the abrogation of that responsibility. Regulation is the norm. Prohibition is the radical experiment. Activities that take place outside of a regulatory framework would remain prohibited. Regulation is distinct, clearly, from unregulated free markets. We're not interested in libertarian positions on this. These are the things. Clearly, it's pretty obvious what you can regulate when you bring things under government regulation and control. There are 5 basic models: prescription, pharmacy sales, licensed retail, licensed premises for consumption on the premises, as with pubs, and unlicensed sales. And basically, the relative dangers associated with the use of each drug determine which particular model it sits in. More restrictive for more dangerous drugs, less restrictive for less dangerous ones. Again, these are models that are already in place. This is not, there's no need to move to a brave new world. This is a safe consumption room in the top left-hand corner. It's a hell of a lot better than injecting behind the bins in a car park. It's happening. This is happening now, and this is why we need to engage with this move. All over the world, governments and citizens are moving away from prohibition and towards legal regulation. Just wanted to show you this lastly. This is an extraordinary statement by the US Assistant Secretary of State, William Brownfield. We believe the international community should tolerate different national drug policies. Other countries will legalize entire categories of drugs. This is the US State Department. This is the guy who pretty much tells everybody on earth what they ought to be doing about their drug policy. The US is ready for change, and when the US is ready for change, we can all change. Lastly, I just wanted to come back to this, because this is technical stuff, it's political stuff. The bottom line is that this is about people. And where this engages with recovery, going back to the start, is it is almost impossible to recover in a war zone. Coming back to Fiona's description of the need to move towards a peaceful approach, one based on, as I said, tolerance, acceptance, love and compassion, but not for the industries that are making money out selling drugs. They just need to be controlled and regulated. They don't need to be left unfettered in the way that we have with big pharma, alcohol and tobacco, and they shouldn't be abrogated to criminal organizations and unregulated dealers. That's where the regulation comes in. The love and compassion, tolerance and acceptance comes at the level of use. We need to change, and we need to do it quickly. The opportunity is here. The US have said we can. Let's do it. Lastly, one other thing. One of the ways that we can do this is people need to stop voting for prohibition. Each time you cast a vote, unless you've been very careful in terms of checking out who your MP is, chances are you voted for it. Stop doing it, check it out, and make sure that your MP shifts or vote for somebody else. Thank you.
Good morning, ladies and gents. Thank you for that introduction. I'll make my own apologies. I will be nowhere near as well prepared or PowerPoint presentations as the previous speakers, so please do accept my apologies from that. I've had about 5 minutes to prepare for this, so I suppose what I'm going to say comes with a bit of a health warning, if you like. Is these are my own personal thoughts from the last 10-15 minutes listening to what a lot's been said, and born out of my last 16 years experience as an operational police officer. So just to give you the context, I suppose, from the platform which I'm speaking, I joined South Yorkshire Police in 2000 as a 22-year-old exceptionally naive individual. I had no idea what people term the real world was like. So it certainly was an eye-opener. And part of that particular eye-opening was how common, if you like, drugs were. I'd come, if I'm brutally honest, from a very closeted environment, a good education, stable family background, etc. So it really was quite an experience to understand, like I use the term again, not that one I'm particularly fond of, what the real world was like. And it took me a long time to understand the drivers of criminality. And if I'm honest, it's one of the frustrations I have with the way that policing is viewed, is your better police officers are born out of experience. You can't teach policing. And at the risk of getting on my soapbox, it's fundamental for me that a good police officer has a wide experience, and a lot of that can only be learned through the job. And it takes me on to the point I make about what the job of the police is. It's an interesting one because a lot of hostility is directed towards the police and legislation, the rights and wrongs and what have you. But the actual role of the police to me is actually quite a pure, or it should be quite a pure one. We are there to enforce the legislation that is put in place by the democratically elected government of the day. We don't make the laws, and I'm actually exceptionally glad for that, because I think it's an absolutely essential part of our justice system. The government write the laws, we enforce the laws, the CPS choose to prosecute, and the judiciary judge people on guilt or otherwise, and sentencing. And each one of those components is distinctly and definitely and appropriately separate. Because if you can imagine a situation where the police are making their own laws as to what they as individuals feel are right and wrong, because the police aren't elected, you'd obviously, well, it's the foundation of a police state. So it is a little bit with frustration that we get blamed for a lot of the ills of the day, because at the end of the day, and again I'm mindful of what using this phrase sounds like, we are doing our job, we are doing what is asked of us. Now, in relation to a lot of legislation, it's an interesting debate, and one that I'm very open-minded to, because if you look at the vast majority of criminal legislation, it is there to protect a third party. Assault legislation is to stop you going out and punching someone on the nose. Sexual offences is to protect an individual from inappropriate sexual contact. Theft is to protect your property that you have earned and purchased from being stolen by a separate individual. Now, the simple possession legislation is an interesting one, because the offender and the victim are arguably one and the same person. There is no third party. You possessing an individual amount of a controlled substance, there is no third party victim to that. So I suppose what that legislation is looking at, and this is where the interesting part of the debate is where the responsibility of the state is in relation to protecting an individual from themselves. Now, I've obviously listened to the previous people, and like I said, a lot of, and I'm not in any way, shape or form trying to trivialise your personal experiences. I have no doubt that you have been through the mill in previous times. I've completely forgotten the point I was going to make. That's my preparation of ad-libbing, isn't it? It's where does the state stand to protect its people? And a lot of it's not there to persecute the individual. I suppose if you looked at the principle behind why the legislation was put in the first place, it is to deter people from going into drugs in the first place, therefore protecting people from ever becoming drug addicts. It's not there just to stigmatise and cause an individual hardship. I suppose the principle behind it is to protect it. And again, if that isn't working, and I don't pretend to be an expert on drugs in any way, shape or form, if that isn't working, then I do agree, and I think many of my peers and my colleagues would agree, that it is time to have a review of, and looking, if it isn't working, what else is there that we could possibly take as an approach to this. Now, our relationship in relation to where we are presently, and when I was listening to the previous speakers, I must confess I didn't actually recognise the police services that they were describing. In the 16 years, let's give you a bit more of my background, the 16 years that I've been a uniform officer in the South Yorkshire Police, I've worked at Doncaster for a few years, came across to Sheffield, went back to Doncaster, went to Rotherham, and back to Sheffield again. Now, all of those areas are metropolitan areas, and all of those areas have significant issues and problems with drug misuse. And I can absolutely, honestly, hand on heart say that we have never gone out, either as individuals, as a team, or as a district, gone out to persecute individual drug users. And that's not to say we haven't arrested people for possession, because we happen to have come across whether or not they were being searched for in a high burglary area and they happen to have drugs on them, or as a result of a separate issue they have drugs on them and therefore they were arrested. But I can honestly say, hand on heart, there has never been a drive to go out and get individuals and persecute the individual for that. Now, to put that into a sort of like a more contemporary thing, and then again it was the interesting thing that we said about the festival. I mean, there have been recent musical events in the city centre here where we have had a drugs policy, where there have been tipping points to make an arrest. But to get to those tipping points, I don't think it's an understatement to say we really will have had our arm forced up our back to make that arrest. In the queues there are 2, 3, if not 4 drop boxes. There are signs saying, please, if you have anything on you, get rid of it before you get to the front. And you can see the people, through experience, the people that fill in with their pockets as they're moving down the line, and they get to the first box and you're thinking, please, put it in the box. They get to the second box, you say, please, put it in the box. They get to the third one, they still haven't. You almost want to just put it in the bloody box, because we do not want to be losing staff, because the criminal justice system and the process now is, if you make a simple arrest for possession, you're potentially going to lose 1, if not 2 officers for a significant period of time, a number of hours, and you have other issues, other policing issues with the staffing that we have available. We do not want to be engaging, on a quite a selfish perspective, I suppose, in spending a large amount of time in processing individuals for minor possession offences. So maybe it went on in the 80s and the 90s, and perhaps there were different drivers in terms of police performance back then. But I suppose the point I want to make now is, don't judge necessarily the present police service by the sins of its fathers. The attitude and the approach to it is very different now. It is much more supportive, I would like to think, and it does recognise many of the issues and the debates that have been spoken about today. Our focus will always remain now on, it sounds a bit of a cliche, on risk and harm. We have moved away from a target culture in terms of the number of burglaries perhaps, or the number of arrests made, and what, with limited resources, again one of the key drivers that we face these days, is we focus our resources where the risk and the harm to the wider community are. Now, taking it back to the drugs debate, that focuses our attention on organised crime groups, or OCGs. Now, I don't think it's an exaggeration to say that almost every firearms discharge that's gone on in this city in the last 12 months, every murder that's gone on in the last however long, and a not insignificant proportion of serious assaults have all been directly linked to the drugs trade. Now, what it is that's driving that is the money that's involved in it. And the wider issues, obviously, in firearms discharges and other serious criminality that it drives, we as a police service cannot ignore. We have to get involved in that, and quite rightly so. And I think there is an interesting debate and a distinction that does need to be made between that kind of activity, the stuff that is causing serious harm to wider communities, and a lot of what goes on in terms of lower level individual possession. There's other things that it drives. Human trafficking is something that's becoming ever more prevalent, and along with prostitution, along with prostitution, the drugs trade in terms of cannabis gardening, etc., that drives a lot of that. So it's very difficult to separate out the supply and the criminality with the actual use of drugs in itself, because it's not such a clear thing. It's not so easy to compartmentalise. Now, on a personal stance, like I said, I'm more than interested in the debate, because it clearly isn't working at present. There are individuals who suffer a disproportionate amount of ill effects to them in relation to what they've done. I'm not absolutely convinced that, again, it goes back to what you said about prohibition and legalisation and what have you. Will solve all of the ills. I don't think it's an absolute panacea. But for me, if there was to be one element to take out of drugs which would reduce the associated criminality, it's the money that's involved. Whatever the solution that comes out of this, What it needs to do is remove the financial gain from those individuals involved in drug supply, because that is what is driving the criminality. That is what is, because it's a seller's market at the minute. High prices drive acquisitive crime. The profits that can be made drive the serious and organised crime. So whilst I certainly don't profess to know what the solution will be, for me a key part of that solution would be to remove the financial gain from those involved in the selling of the drugs.
So we just thought we'd like to just do a couple more questions with you. So we'll just run through those. So statement 1.
Before Mark Gilman starts his talk, we're going to just show a short film clip.
Be seated. Regarding Officer Dozeman, his condition has been upgraded to guarded. Until he can receive visits, he needs to move to recovery unit. As of this tour, all hand-to-hand undercover buys of CDS are suspended in the Western District. Somewheres back in the dawn of time, this district had itself a civic dilemma of epic proportion. The city council had just passed a law that forbid alcoholic consumption in public places, on the streets and on the corners. But the corner is, and it was, and it always will be, the poor man's lounge. It's where a man wants to be on a hot summer's night. It's cheaper than a bar, catch a nice breeze, you watch your girls go by. But the law is the law. The Western cops rolling by, what were they gonna do? They arrested every dude out there for tipping back a high life. There'd be no other time for any other kind of police work. And if they looked the other way, they'd open themselves to all kinds of flaunting, all kinds of disrespect. Now, this is before my time when it happened, but somewhere back in the 50s or 60s, there was a small moment of goddamn genius by some nameless smokehound who comes out to cut rate one day, and on his way to the corner, he slips that just bought pint of elderberry into a paper bag. A great moment of civic compromise. That small, wrinkled-ass paper bag allowed the corner boys to have their drink in peace, and it gave us permission to go and do police work. The kind of police work that's actually worth the effort. That's worth actually taking a bullet for. Dozeman, you got shot last night trying to buy 3 vials. 3. There's never been a paper bag for drugs. Until now.
I'm only going to literally 8 minutes, something like that, because I wanted to throw that bit in about the wire, because it's just such a masterpiece on the madness of prohibition. And the corner as a textbook, although it's an ethnography. Jeff Pearson, a big hero of mine, died a couple of years ago. He used to be a professor of criminology, and he always used to say the very best ethnography should read like a novel. Yeah, you should want to read it. So read the corner. What I want to do now, though, because I was conscious of other things that people were saying, is focus on one particular area that seems to me an absolute case study in the insanity of prohibition, and that's the case of psychedelics. So if you look at the harm caused by drugs, yeah, we know, you know the harm index. I've got 2 daughters, right? 2 daughters, 16 and 17. Hopefully they're going to go to university soon, and I'll tell you what drug terrifies me most, them. Much more than MDMA, much more than cannabis, yeah? White lightning, the alcohol that's never seen an apple. The alcohol that is never passed around with your vol-au-vents in the posh part of Sheffield, is it? Would you like your white cider chilled, Mark, or at what room temperature with your vol-au-vent? No, it's not for that, is it? It's for that group that Danny talked about before. They aren't drugs for people who want to have fun. They are for people who want to escape from themselves. They are people who are dealing with some form of trauma. And the absolute insanity of having this thing called spice washed down with legally available 24/7, 365, with an Aqualunga white cider, or a Zeppelin as they're now known, yeah? Together with whichever form of supermarket's own vodka you want, yeah? But let's have it get the picture complete as well, because it's not just alcohol, is it? You know, if you're prepared to go to one of these drug services and go through the palaver of filling all the forms in and all the rest of it, then you can get all manner of other goodies as well. You can get methadone, buprenorphine, codeine, dihydrocodone, tramadol, and for that bad back, that elusive bad back, the pregabalin doctor. the gabapentin for that lower muscle pain, you know what I mean? So there's all manner of goodies that you can get if you're prepared to, and of course, I absolutely need the diazepam for that muscle spasm. You know, it's not so much the anxiolytic properties of it. You know what I mean? If you're prepared to blag all that, you can get it all legal, yeah? Just got to fill a few forms in on NDTMS. But look at this. There's a stronger link between childhood trauma and addiction than there is between obesity and diabetes. 2/3 of addicts report being abused as children. That means that the war on drugs, as Fiona said, is not only a war on people, it's a war on a particular kind of people, yeah? It's a war on black people, it's a war on people of colour, and it's a war on traumatised people who need help. Because for addicts and alcoholics, drink and drugs aren't their problem. Drink and drugs are their solution, yeah? They're absolutely their solution, and recovery is about finding a different solution. So the war on drugs, in my opinion, is not just a war on people, it's a war on traumatised people that need help. Psychedelics have been used since the dawn of time, yeah? With all manner of shamanic rituals, coming of age by almost every ancient civilization have been using psychedelics to aid human consciousness, yeah? There's LSD, look, yeah? Lysergic diethylamide. There's Freud, yeah? Aldous Huxley, Beyond the Doors of Perception, etc., etc., yeah? So if trauma is the major driver of those people who enter our drug and alcohol treatment services, where is psychiatry's antibiotic, yeah? And I want to suggest that there is one staring us right in the face, but because of prohibition, we choose not to use it, and it's ecstasy. Methylene dioxin methamphetamine is incredibly effective with a good evidence base for people whose addiction has its roots in trauma, yeah? It's been used a lot now with veterans who've developed drug and alcohol problems as a direct result of post-traumatic stress disorder. It's short-acting. It's less disturbing than LSD. So you can go into the, you can have a mooch about in the shallow end of psychedelia, yeah, yeah. Without diving off the high board, into the full 250 micrograms of lysergic diethylamide, maybe later once you've had but it's invariably pleasurable, yeah? It's safe in therapeutic applications, and here's the thing, it allows access to repressed emotional memories and enhances empathy. It's a fantastic tool for directly addressing trauma-induced addiction, for which, in my personal opinion, that accounts for the vast majority of people in our drug and alcohol treatment services. But remember, this is clinical MDMA, it's not recreational ecstasy. And then people say, oh, come on, Mark, what are you talking about? Seriously? You're going to give psychiatric patients LSD, magic mushrooms, cannabis and MDMA? Well, we already give them methadone, buprenorphine, methylphenidate, carpet, close as open heart surgery. That's a level playing field, that. Not. Yeah, that's your level playing field. Now, how on earth do I, having been studying recovery and representing Public Health England until the 20th of July just gone as the recovery lead, square all that up with recovery? Well, because, thank you very much, of Carl Gustav Jung, no less, yeah? Who is responsible for that launching into a lecture on Alcoholics Anonymous, but for the students of Alcoholics Anonymous will know the role, the central role that Carl Gustav Jung plays in the etiology and the evolution of Alcoholics Anonymous. Because what did he say to Roland Hazard in 1929? He said in a Zurich accent, whatever that is, not a Bury accent, he said something like, Roland, you're not a heavy drinker, pal. You're not a binge drinker. You're not the kind of guy who goes to bed with Marilyn Monroe and wakes up with Marilyn Manson. No. You, my friend, you drink because you need drink in order to be. Your desire for drugs and drink in this case, your desire for drink is of a fundamental nature. You're not just a heavy drinker. It's about your being, your entire being, meaning and purpose. Yeah? Spiritus contra spiritum. You are looking for the spirit of the universe, God, or whatever you mean understand by that, and you're finding it regularly at the bottom of a bottle of vodka. Yeah? But unfortunately it wears off. So we then know that the next stage is Bill. And Bill comes along, and if you look at Bill's story, what does he say in chapter 1 of the big book of Alcoholics Anonymous? Why don't you choose your own conception of God? Yeah? That statement hit me hard. It melted the icy intellectual mountain in whose shadow I had lived and shivered many years, and I stood in the sunlight at last. Remember, historians of AA, what the medication was for alcoholism in Towns Hospital in 1935, 'twas belladonna. Psychedelic. So, should we be surprised that our very own Bill Wilson, and a hero to many of us who've been studying Alcoholics Anonymous and regard Alcoholics Anonymous and the big book as probably the single most important feature of contemporary recovery, personally speaking, yeah, was no stranger to psychedelics. But the madness of the war on drugs is that and prohibition, is that we deny access to particular drugs like methylene dioxymethamphetamine, ecstasy, with a good track record. Professor David Nutt's got some research, got some permission to do it. Dr. Ben Sessa has also got some money and permission to do it. And hopefully, through their work, we can actually end the insanity of denying access to a fundamental, for me, the antibiotic of psychiatry, psychedelics. Thank you very much.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for inviting me to speak here. As you say, I'm from Law Enforcement Against Prohibition, which is a global organisation. We now have formally represented in 20 countries, and we're spreading rapidly. In the UK, we launched just last week in the House of Commons, Committee Room 10, and it was a packed house, and we managed to tell the tale of the whole roadmap of prohibition from our point of view. We had an officer from the Grenadier Guards who policed the poppy fields in Afghanistan. We had ex-MI5, former chief constables. We had a former chief of police from Germany, police major from the United States. We had all manner of people. We had something like 20 different speakers. So we could show really from start to finish every aspect of the war on drugs, and from the aspect of people who have been there, have policed it, and have studied it as well. We know what we're talking about. And so the spread of our organisation across the globe, I hope, will add to that zeitgeist. So there's something in the air that Danny says. My role in the police, I finished as a detective sergeant, but for around 14 years of my career, I worked undercover. And basically, it wasn't not the glamorous kind of undercover work. I generally started at the base level, mixed amongst problematic drug users, and tried to work my way up to mid-level gangsters, sort of who would run the sort of street supply. And I mean, when I started in the job, I actually believed that one smoke of crack cocaine and that's it, you're addicted for life. I even remember that coming. I'm sure it was Ronald Reagan actually saying that on the TV. I remember that, and I went into the police believing that. Extremely conservative background, but working in undercover work, I quickly realised that the war on drugs was unwinnable, and that the idea of a drug-free world is literally farcical. So drugs are harmful, but how do we manage it? Because that's what we have to decide, and we're not managing it at the moment. Now, I totally agree with the Chief Inspector, much of what he said, and especially the fact that any solution, any change and solution that we have has to take the money away from organised crime, because organised crime just causes devastation. It's not quite clear, I don't believe, to the general public just how insidious organised crime is, and just how much influence they have over communities. Where communities become separate from policing, organised crime groups intimidate those communities. So crime detection figures are less where organised crime groups have power. And they have power because they intimidate communities. So you get burgled, you call the police, you could be considered a grass for that. And it's generally poorer areas as well. Now, I said that I realised the war on drugs was farcical. I still carried on working because there's always gangsters to catch. And I wasn't going to stop trying to catch gangsters just because I realised the war on drugs was ridiculous. You know, there's always bad people to catch. And I remember I did a job in Northamptonshire where I was I'd given up undercover work, but they tempted me into that because they said, oh, well, these burger bar boys, they're raping people as punishment for drug debts and for, you know, if they think they're talking to the police. And the reason they do that is to spread fear, because fear is control, but the trouble is, over that 14 years, I can look back and I see it's an arms race that's got no chance of de-escalation. For every tactic the police uses, there's always a pushback from organised crime. And there's no de-escalation because the war keeps raging. And eventually, it occurred to me, I was slow with this, and I hope that by speaking to people, people can see the simple truth in this, quicker than I did, in conclusion, that actually the reason every year the gangsters were getting more nasty was down to me. Well, not just me, but people doing my job. Because for many of the gangsters, the only way some of them are going to get caught is through undercover work. Some of them. That's why undercover work, it's a tactic of last resort. It can only be used where normal policing methods are ineffective. Some of these people are only going to get caught by people like me. And the tactics that we were having to develop all the time, there was a natural pushback. A natural pushback. So the increased aggression, the increased kickback from organised crime is a direct result of policing prohibition. So it is policing the war on drugs which is making things perpetually worse. And if you've got any doubt of what direction we're going in, just look at Mexico. They might see a long, long way away, but it's only going in that direction. Different countries, it'll be happening at a different speed. Organised crime, like any unregulated market, they want to become a monopoly. And what I would point out is that, just two last things to say. At the end of Prohibition in America, the murder rate had been steadily climbing at an alarming rate. I should have brought a slide to show you actually, but please look it up online. Murder rate, Prohibition, 1933, it dropped literally overnight to a third of what it had been the previous year. The moment alcohol Prohibition ended. That will happen in terms of organised crime and the violence when we regulate drugs, because brewery bosses don't have shootouts for who sells the beer. Thanks.
So I'm a co-founder of Recovering Justice with Fiona. If anyone wants to get in touch with questions, it's Fiona. Ignore the bottom one. It was really interesting when David spoke to begin with, just off my notes here, that the barriers to recovery, because you had gender, so female, older, mental health, and forensic history. It's like, fuck, I'm done. But however, I'm just going to do what I've set out to do and go with it, because I'm a bit nervous. Anyway, so, right, everyone in this room will know somebody who's been affected by substance misuse, someone suffering or might be in recovery. You might not know that fact about them, but there'll be someone in this room that either knows somebody or is in recovery or even suffering. So I'm here. I'm actually an ex-police officer in the 90s. I worked in Newcastle's East End. I joined CID, worked on crime teams, and was an undercover drugs buyer operative. But I'm actually in long-term recovery as well. I'm in long-term recovery from problematic substance misuse, which is the correct term to be using now. And I say problematic, but actually my using had catastrophic consequences. I was arrested multiple times. I woke up in police cells, not knowing, having a clue what I'd done, only to find when I got the charge sheet read in front of me what I'd done. I woke up many times in hospital, not having a clue how I'd got there, and I ended up homeless. But I'm actually one of the lucky ones to be here today. 7.5 years ago, I woke up in hospital again, attached to monitors, not really believing that I was dead, and I wanted to die. That's where it took me. I actually wanted out. It was the easiest option for me, I believed at the time. But how did I change and how did I get into recovery? Well, it wasn't the police cells, the court appearances, it wasn't being stigmatised and marginalised by society, being made to feel I was some deprived person who lacked moral fibre, who didn't have the willpower to just stop, or even worse, a woman who couldn't stop using for her children. It was the people I'd seen in recovery previously, those people that had tried to help me many times before. They were by my hospital bed when I woke up. No matter what I did, they continued to support and help me. They showed me that recovery was possible. I didn't know about recovery. I didn't get it. I was one of those unfortunate ones that was just never going to get it. And what they did is they nurtured me and they loved me. They showed me compassion and supported me until I could do it for myself. So I worked hard at my recovery. I work at it every day. It's not easy. It's hard. But it's the best thing I ever did. And a few years ago, I saw a film called The Anonymous People, and it showed me the importance of being a visible, vocal person in recovery. And to show other people that recovery was possible. And we need people to break down the barriers that prevent people from seeking help, treatment, and move out of the problems and into the solutions. Now I believe, I stand here today, as part of Recovering Justice as well, that one of the biggest barriers to people with problematic substance misuse is the current drug policies. I look at my work in the police as an officer, particularly working undercover, all driven by current drug policies. The aim was to target drug sellers, users, get them locked up, reduce the amount of crime, reduce the amount of drugs, therefore reduce the amount of drug users, and it just doesn't happen. And I'm ashamed of the part I played, because I wasn't arresting the people with the gold taps on the baths and the jacuzzis and the Ferraris. It wasn't. I was tearing people apart and destroying people's lives, and there were people from socially deprived, high unemployment, no hope backgrounds. And all I did was make that worse. I helped incarcerate people who didn't need police cells, prison sentences and criminal records. They need help and treatment. Rich people go to rehab, poor people go to prison. Like I said, I'm one of the lucky ones, but I'm also a wife, a mother, a daughter, a sister. Problematic substance misuse doesn't just only devastate the person that's suffering, it devastates the family. It's a family illness, and they all need help within that. As part of Recovering Justice, we want to unite people, those in recovery, those that are using, those who may be sitting in this room who know someone that's suffering or in recovery. We want to see drug policy reform through a regulated and controlled market, a peaceful solution to the war on drugs. By visibility, using our voices, creating recovery communities, and help change. And I just want to show you a small clip, a trailer from The Anonymous People, which is the film which you can get on Netflix. which is what part of America. There's a big community there, recovery community there, and it's what we really need to establish here in the UK.
Whether we want to admit this or not, this is our Black Plague.
There's 25 million people that suffer from this illness.
We have an epidemic.
It's a national crisis that untreated addiction cost our economy over $550 billion last year.
It is disgraceful that we have done so little about it thus far.
Once you're an addict, you're that thing that they have to hide.
So many people think of addicts as homeless people living under bridges.
The media is difficult for us to battle against because the negative news about addiction is dramatic.
You know what we in the media do? We wink it. We Snoop Dogg it. Hey, oh yeah, they're stoned, that's fine.
If everyone thinks of alcoholism and addiction as a negative thing, no one's going to want to go get help.
As a culture, we are still very rooted in just say no.
Drugs are menacing our society.
We're going to try to incarcerate our way out of the addiction problem.
Our jails are full of addicts and alcoholics. They're all pulled up in one spot.
When you're caught, you will do time.
Recovery is what you need, not prison. Hello?
Alcoholism has too long been a taboo subject.
The shame and secrecy are just as deadly as the disease itself.
Our numbers are unbelievably strong, but yet we have no voice.
We know about every issue out there, but people don't know how important the issue of recovery is.
As a person in long-term recovery from an illness that has no cure, but an illness that has a solution.
If we could ever tap those 20 million people in long-term recovery, you'd change this overnight.
Now it's my turn to teach you that recovery works.
History's on our side. History will show one day who and what we are. So I say we make history.
Voices are out there. We have to find and open the hearts. And I think those hearts want to be open.
I refuse to feel ashamed of who I am. I most certainly will not be embarrassed that I'm an addict. I'm going to tell whoever I damn well want to.
There's a lot of us. Everyone knows somebody.
Final presenter is also from Transform and is Jane Slater.
So my name's Jane Slater. I work at Transform Drug Policy Foundation along with Danny and Ian. And as you've heard, essentially what we're calling for is an end to the war on drugs. We think that drugs should be taken out of the hands of organised criminals and put into the hands of doctors, pharmacists and licensed retailers. But don't worry, I'm not going to repeat Danny's and Ian's speeches. I'm here to talk to you about our new campaign. And I'm just going to give you a very short overview about it. So the new campaign is called Anyone's Child, Families for Safer Drug Control. The aim of this is to tell the real life human stories behind the war on drugs. Now to me, if this was going to be an argument that was won on evidence, I actually think we probably have won it. I feel at Transform we walk around with big heavy tomes of information, arguing out all the policy points with the policy wonks. But to me there's something else wrapped up in this. There's the stigma and the stigma that's brought out in the film we've just watched. And I think we need to tackle that. One of the very few arguments we come up against at Transform is the line, it's the Tony Blair line of, oh, can't possibly consider changing our policy for drugs, terrified for my children. So what we've done is we've formed a group of families who are coming forward and saying, look, you're saying that these policies are designed to protect our children, but wait a second, my children weren't protected. In fact, the drug laws made their lives a hell of a lot worse. And so they're telling their stories. So in the group we have a whole range of members, including the very inspiring Anne-Marie Coburn, who very tragically lost her 15-year-old daughter to an ecstasy overdose. Now, two of the factors there was the purity. It was something ridiculously strong, the MDMA she took, something like 5 times the recommended dosage for a fully grown adult. And Martha, her daughter, was tiny. She was 15. The second thing was, as 15-year-olds sat in a park watching their friends clearly not in a good place, the friends were terrified. What didn't they do that they should have done was call an ambulance on time. Again, these are children rationally behaving, worrying about the criminal repercussions of what their friend's done. If they got her to hospital, it's arguable the situation could have ended differently. Now that is a harm of a policy, not a harm of the drug itself. We've also got Mick and Hope in the group. Their son, whilst at university up in Manchester, bought the drugs for the student home. They had it in a bowl on the mantelpiece, all of them for the Saturday night. The police came along. When they were asked about it, he admitted that yes, they were the drugs for the student house, and they decided to show an example of him. He served 15 months in prison in Manchester for that. And the repercussions of his life, I suppose that's the thing. It's like he's now struggled, despite having a master's, to get long-term stable employment. He works as a wood carver on the roadside. It shows that these things have longer repercussions than the night out. And so what are we doing with this group? We're going out, we've got a political side to this campaign. We're writing letters to local MPs, demanding meetings, telling our stories, trying to educate our politicians. We're also doing a series of events around the country, which we're doing in combination with law enforcement against prohibition. So we can put a parent to tell their story alongside a police officer with the policy knowledge, and to keep explaining why we believe that prohibition is the wrong approach for this policy. And in addition, we've got a media strategy. So we're trying to hit the mainstream press, again, to try and change the public on this issue, and to show that legal regulation is in fact not a radical solution. It is a mainstream middle ground position that we should be supporting. And this year in April, there is a major UN meeting. It's called the UNGAS, the UN General Assembly Special Session on Drugs. And this is a very significant moment in drug policy because it's something that happens every 10 years. They meet, the UN, they look at the drug policies, and normally they commit to continue fighting the good fight. But this is significant because it's been brought forward by 3 years at the request of the Latin American countries. Now this is where the real war is being fought as such. And it presents an opportunity for us to come forward and show our displeasure at our current policy and to show why we're demanding a new approach. And so we're taking families from Kenya, Afghanistan, America, Canada, all across the world to this event to stand up and to show, look, this really could happen to anyone's child. And to explain the project far better than I can, I want to show you a very quick video now, which is of one of the families who's involved in the project. It's Rose Humphreys, who very tragically lost 2 of her sons to heroin overdoses.
I never dreamed I'd have one son die from a heroin overdose, never mind 2. Jake and Roll were born 3.5 years apart, but they were the best of friends from day one, and whatever Jake did, Roland wanted to do. To start with, Jake was a really happy little boy. He was very, very creative and intelligent. But as he went through middle school, he seemed to become sadder quite a lot of the time. And then he just became a really sullen teenager. We just thought that we'd been lucky to get away with our first son, Jonathan, not showing those signs of a terrible teenager. I realised when Jake and Roll were in later teenage that they were using drugs, cannabis, amphetamines, magic mushrooms. I would have the conversations with them that you were supposed to have, you know, which in those days it was always just say no. They would leave me feeling reassured. Sometimes they would actually say that they thought people who took drugs were stupid. The police were involved a few times. Oh, Jeremy and I would have long discussions about what the boys were doing and what could we do about it. Eventually, they started using heroin and things got worse. I just couldn't feel that I could say to anybody that my sons were using drugs, and especially not heroin, because of the opinion people have of drug users and would have judged me as a parent, you know, thinking how on earth could she bring her boys up to be like that. When the truth was, I'd done everything I could to support them and try to bring them up in the right way. When Roll was 23, he was at a friend's house. Their parents were away. We wonder if the reason they didn't call 999 immediately was because they thought the police might become involved and they were afraid of getting into trouble. By the time they did call 999 and the ambulance arrived, it was too late. Roland was dead. Jake managed to turn his life around eventually in the years that followed. He worked hard, got back into exercise, undertook a master's degree, found a partner, and had a baby. But I don't think he ever really got over the guilt of the way his little brother died. Just when I thought Jake would stay drug-free forever, he relapsed. He kept it secret from everyone and thought he could deal with it himself. He was found dead alone in his room. I just feel that if instead of going to a street dealer to get those drugs when he relapsed, he'd been able to go to a clinic where there would have been counselling and advice at the same time, there would have been a completely different outcome. People will always want to take drugs. You're never going to be able to stop people taking drugs. This is why I want the government to look at ways in which we could change our drugs laws to make people safer. 10 miles from here is a natural burial ground. 2 of my sons are lying there. I'm hoping that with the Anyone's Child campaign, we might be able to prevent other people's children ending up in the same way.
What we were now wanting to do is to have the final round of voting. So can voters please take their panels and prepare themselves for the next set of questions. Just while we're doing this, I want to make an observation, which is, as we were setting up this discussion, I tried to call in a lot of favours with policy colleagues. If anyone feels we've been biased in favour of a kind of pro-legalisation or pro-decriminalisation position, I tried really hard to get policy makers, some of whom I've worked with for years, to come and talk in favour of the status quo or in favour of prohibition, and I couldn't get anyone to come and talk. Now, this may reflect my lack of popularity, but it may also reflect that this is a position that people are struggling with. So please don't think that we started from a position of saying we wanted to have a particular stance. We started trying to be as open and balanced as possible. If it doesn't feel like that, it's really about the people who were passionate and committed enough to come and speak here today. So, with that having been said, This is a significant issue of social justice for us. We don't want this to be a one-off event. Some of the results we've shown in the presentations we will showcase on our Helena Kennedy Centre website. If you're interested in following and pursuing this discussion and the debate, please keep in touch with us, because we feel that for us this should be a way of engaging a conversation. It feels to me, and Michaela's already touched on this, the recovery versus decriminalisation has been a false dichotomy. I think some of us have made the mistake of embracing previously. These are really important issues, and we'd encourage everybody to become more actively involved. So finally, thank you all very much, and please keep in contact with us. Thank you.